On the evening of November 9, 1989, East Berlin was quiet, tense, uncertain, waiting. Then, during a routine press conference, a government spokesman named Gunter Schabowski glanced at a memo and made history. When asked when new travel freedoms would take effect, he hesitated, then uttered 3 words: ab sofort, unverzüglich, effective immediately. He hadn't meant to open the border, but within hours, thousands of East Germans flooded the checkpoints, demanding passage. Confused guards, overwhelmed and unprepared, let them through. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of division for nearly 3 decades, crumbled not with force, but with a slip of the tongue. How did one sentence unravel an empire? In the aftermath of the Second World War, Germany was less a nation than a fractured idea. Once the core of Hitler's empire, it had been reduced to rubble and partitioned like a carcass by the victorious Allies. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union each claimed zones of occupation. And while these divisions were meant to be temporary, the ideological chasm between East and West quickly hardened into permanence. Nowhere was this division more visible, more palpable, than in Berlin. The city lay deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone of East Germany, yet it too had been divided among the Allies. To the west, 3 sectors, American, British, and French, coalesced into a free, capitalist enclave. To the east, the Soviets ruled with the iron grip of communism. Berlin became a microcosm of the Cold War, a city where 2 worlds collided not just in ideology, but in daily life. Streets that began in the democratic West might end in the authoritarian East. Families, friends, and colleagues were separated by nothing more than arbitrary political boundaries. In the early years, these borders remained porous. By the late 1940s and 1950s, East Germans could simply cross into West Berlin, where the lights shone brighter, shop windows brimmed with goods, and people spoke freely without fear of surveillance. It was not merely a matter of material comfort. It was the contrast between a life constrained by the secret police and a life with the promise of opportunity. For the East German regime, led by the Socialist Unity Party under Walter Ulbricht, this flow of people represented a hemorrhage. Each defector was not just a citizen lost, but an indictment of the system itself. The numbers told a damning story. Between 1949 and 1961, nearly 3 million East Germans fled to the west, many through Berlin. These were not merely the poor or disillusioned. They were engineers, doctors, teachers, students, the very lifeblood of the nation's future. The East was bleeding talent, and the regime feared collapse if the exodus continued. Moscow, under Nikita Khrushchev, also grew restless. The Soviet Union could not maintain a satellite state whose people openly voted with their feet for another way of life. Something had to be done. Thus was born the idea of sealing the border, not just with checkpoints and guards, but with a physical barrier. Officially, the East German leadership framed the decision as a defensive necessity. Ulbricht famously declared in June 1961, "No one has the intention of building a wall." Yet behind closed doors, plans were already underway. On the night of August 12th to 13th, 1961, as Berliners slept, East German police and soldiers rolled out barbed wire and concrete posts along the border. By morning, streets were severed, railway lines cut, families divided. What began as makeshift fencing rapidly grew into a monstrous edifice of concrete walls, guard towers, floodlights, and minefields. The Berlin Wall was not a single structure, but a complex system of fortifications. There were actually 2 parallel walls with a no-man's land in between, chillingly known as the Death Strip. Here, patrol dogs roamed, soldiers stood watch, and anyone attempting escape risked being shot on sight. In time, the wall stretched for 155 kilometers, encircling all of West Berlin like a prison camp. Its very existence was a paradox. The East German regime insisted it was a protective measure, the anti-fascist protection rampart, guarding against Western aggression. In truth, it was not to keep enemies out, but to keep its own people in. The psychological shock was immediate. Families who had visited one another across boroughs suddenly found themselves sundered. Workers who had commuted daily to West Berlin were cut off from their jobs overnight. Couples were separated, children from parents, friends from friends. There were heart-wrenching scenes of people waving across barbed wire, shouting words of farewell, passing packages through narrow openings until even those were sealed. Berlin, once a crossroads, became a city defined by absence. Yet even as the wall rose higher, so too did the determination of those who refused to be trapped. In the years that followed, East Germans devised daring escape attempts. Some tunneled beneath, others floated over in hot air balloons, still others rammed through checkpoints in modified cars. Each success was a triumph of human ingenuity, each failure a tragedy. The wall became not just a physical structure, but a symbol of repression, a stage upon which stories of courage and despair unfolded. Internationally, the construction of the wall crystallized the Cold War. It was proof that the Soviet model could not survive without coercion. For the West, especially the United States under President John F. Kennedy, the wall was both an outrage and a propaganda gift. Kennedy himself traveled to Berlin in 1963 and stood before the Brandenburg Gate, declaring in his famous speech, "Ich bin ein Berliner." The phrase was not just a gesture of solidarity, but an acknowledgement that Berlin represented the front line of freedom. For East Berliners, however, such words did little to ease daily life. The wall loomed over them as an ever-present reminder of their captivity. Surveillance by the Stasi, the East German secret police, grew ever more intrusive. Every conversation, every friendship, every workplace interaction might be shadowed by informants. The wall was not merely bricks and mortar, but the architecture of fear, designed to convince people not to dream of freedom at all. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the wall had become a grotesque normality. Children were born who knew no other reality. Tourists came to gawk from the West, taking photographs of the grim gray barrier, while artists turned it into a canvas of graffiti and protest. For those within East Germany, it was both mundane and unbearable, a horizon of concrete against which all hopes seemed to crash. Yet even in its immensity, the wall carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. The very act of building it acknowledged that the system could not stand without force. The longer it stood, the more visible became the contrast between repression and freedom, poverty and abundance, silence and expression. The story of the Berlin Wall's fall cannot be told without understanding its birth. It was not a mere accident of history, but the calculated response of a regime cornered by its own failures. It was built to contain a population restless for more, yet it also transformed that restlessness into a moral force that would, decades later, erupt in joyous defiance. And when the wall finally cracked, it would be the same hunger for freedom, the same will to live without barriers, that surged through its ruins. The wall was born of fear, but it would die of hope. The wall had been built to prevent flight, but what it could not prevent was longing. For those who lived within East Berlin and across the German Democratic Republic, GDR, daily existence became a careful choreography of obedience and quiet resistance. The concrete barrier was not only a division between East and West, it was a barrier erected inside the hearts of those forced to live under it. In the 1960s, the initial shock of separation had given way to a grim adaptation. Families who had once crossed borough lines for dinner now adjusted to life without their loved ones. Many had relatives only a few hundred meters away on the other side of the wall, yet they might as well have lived on another planet. The Stasi, the State Security Service, warned that expressions of grief or public mourning for separation could be interpreted as dissent. Citizens quickly learned that survival depended on silence. Daily life in East Berlin was a mixture of routine and quiet deprivation. The streets were patrolled by guards, and towers loomed at intervals, casting shadows that lengthened across neighborhoods. The economic reality of the GDR was stark. While West Berlin's shop windows glittered with imported goods, East Berliners waited in long queues for basic necessities: coffee, butter, or fresh fruit. Official propaganda insisted that socialism offered equality, dignity, and sufficiency, but the very existence of the wall betrayed the fragility of those claims. People knew the truth because they could see it with their own eyes from observation platforms along the border. The Stasi infiltrated every aspect of society. By the mid-1970s, it was estimated that 1 in every 60 East Germans served as an informer. Neighbors spied on neighbors, teachers reported on students, Even family members sometimes betrayed one another under pressure. Trust became a scarce commodity. A wrong word, a casual joke, or even a wistful comment about life in the West could lead to interrogation, job loss, or imprisonment. The wall was a physical prison, but the Stasi's surveillance built invisible walls within the human spirit. Yet even under such suffocation, people found ways to live. Schools, though heavily politicized, still educated children. Parks remained places where families gathered, though under the gaze of watchtowers. Churches provided sanctuaries where citizens could voice hopes otherwise unspoken. Music from the West sometimes slipped across the airwaves, songs by the Beatles or the Rolling Stones that carried with them a rhythm of defiance. Youths in the GDR often tuned in secretly to radio stations from West Berlin, dreaming of a life they might never touch. Escape attempts, though perilous, became a persistent feature of life. In the early years after 1961, many tried to climb or leap over the barbed wire. As the wall grew more formidable, with added fences, tripwires, and minefields, escapes became acts of extraordinary ingenuity. Some dug tunnels stretching under the wall, sometimes hundreds of meters long. Others modified vehicles to conceal passengers or crash through barriers. In one famous case, a family constructed a hot air balloon from scraps of fabric and floated over the border to freedom. Each successful escape was celebrated in the West as a triumph of courage. Each failure was a reminder of the wall's cruelty, as bodies fell or were dragged away by soldiers under floodlights. Perhaps the most heartbreaking were the children. Many grew up with divided families they could never visit. Stories circulated of children pressing notes against the wall or waving to grandparents across the death strip. For them, separation was not the memory of a rupture, but the condition of existence. They learned early that the wall defined their world, though their parents often whispered that it would not last forever. That whisper became a kind of inheritance, a quiet promise passed from one generation to the next. While the West regarded the wall as proof of tyranny, the East German government sought to normalize it. The regime erected billboards declaring the wall a protective shield against imperialists and fascists. School children were told to be proud of the barrier, taught that it ensured peace and stability. State television portrayed escapees not as desperate souls, but as criminals and traitors. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. People were expected to celebrate what they privately mourned. Still, despite repression, acts of subtle resistance grew. Underground movements began to emerge, often rooted in the Protestant churches. Citizens gathered in secret to pray, to sing, and to speak openly about freedom. Literature and art became coded languages of dissent. Writers like Christa Wolf explored the inner fractures of East German identity, while painters layered their canvases with symbolic protest. Graffiti, though swiftly removed by authorities, occasionally appeared even on the eastern side of the wall, daring to express forbidden truths. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, the wall became both a scar and a stage. Artists, tourists, and journalists from around the world came to gaze upon it. Musicians held concerts at its edges, their songs carrying across the divide. David Bowie's performance near the Reichstag in 1987 is remembered as one such moment, when the sound of freedom drifted across the barrier and East Berliners pressed closer to listen. These events could not tear down the wall, but they fed the imaginations of those trapped within its shadow. International politics also shaped daily life. Each time tensions rose between the superpowers, Berliners felt the strain. In 1961, U.S. and Soviet tanks faced off at Checkpoint Charlie, barrels pointed at one another across mere meters of space. Though war was averted, the incident left a chilling reminder. Berlin was a tinderbox, and its residents lived with the knowledge that global conflict might ignite in their very streets. By the late 1970s, life under the wall had settled into a paradoxical rhythm, suffocating yet survivable, oppressive yet threaded with defiance. People married, raised children, pursued careers, and cultivated friendships, even as the wall loomed above them. But beneath the surface, a slow erosion was taking place. The promise of socialism seemed increasingly hollow, while whispers of freedom grew stronger. The wall had been meant to silence movement, but it could not silence yearning. Each act of survival, each whispered dream, Each daring escape chipped away at its legitimacy. Though it still stood, unyielding and gray, its days were already numbered, even if few at the time dared to believe it. The human spirit, after all, does not easily surrender to concrete. When the wall first rose in 1961, it was a crude structure of barbed wire and hastily built barriers. In those earliest months, many still believed it could be breached, and the rush of desperate attempts reflected that hope. Dozens sprinted across unguarded gaps, climbed fences, or leapt from windows overlooking the dividing line. Some made it. Others were shot, their bodies a brutal testament to the regime's determination. Yet as the years passed, the wall hardened into a fortress. Concrete slabs replaced wire, floodlights illuminated the death strip, and guard towers bristled with soldiers armed with rifles and orders to shoot. Still, people tried. Escape attempts from East to West Berlin became among the most audacious feats of courage in the 20th century. Each success was a tale of ingenuity, resilience, and desperation. Each failure was a tragedy seared into the city's memory. One of the most famous early escapes involved a group of students in 1962 who dug what became known as Tunnel 57. Armed with little more than shovels, buckets, and youthful determination, they tunneled under the wall for weeks, enduring suffocating air and the constant risk of discovery. Finally, their effort bore fruit. 57 East Germans crawled through to freedom, one after another, in a single night. The tunnel collapsed not long after, but by then its legend had already been sealed. It was not just a hole in the earth, it was a breach in the lie of permanence. Other tunnels followed. Some succeeded, others failed disastrously. There were instances where Stasi informants betrayed plots, leading to arrests before the first shovelful of dirt was removed. In other cases, tunneling teams collapsed underground, nearly suffocating in the dark. Yet the sheer persistence of such attempts revealed the depth of human longing to break free. A regime could control borders with concrete, but it could not wall off imagination. Not all escapes came from below. Some came from above. In 1979, two East German families, the Strelzigs and the Wetzels, secretly stitched together scraps of cloth, bed sheets, and nylon to build a homemade hot air balloon. After months of planning and two failed attempts, they finally succeeded. One night, they ignited their burners, lifted off into the sky, and drifted over the wall under the cover of darkness. When they landed in West Germany, they stepped from the basket into freedom. The world marveled. Newspapers splashed their story across front pages, celebrating both their ingenuity and their courage. The East German regime, humiliated, responded by tightening surveillance and banning access to fabric suitable for balloon making. But the damage was done. The idea of flight had entered the realm of possibility. Then there were the daring vehicle escapes. Some disguised their cars, modifying them with hidden compartments beneath seats or behind panels. A few even armored their vehicles, ramming through checkpoints in a burst of speed and shock. One man famously drove a train across the border, using momentum to smash through barriers before guards could react. Each successful vehicle escape embarrassed the GDR's authorities and inspired others to dream. Even more extraordinary were the human stories that fused desperation with creativity. One man zip-lined across the wall using a pulley and steel cable. Others swam icy rivers or canals, dodging spotlights and gunfire. A group of friends even used a stolen Soviet armored vehicle to crash through the barriers. Each of these attempts carried mortal risk, and not all succeeded. The border guards, following their orders, fired upon many who tried. By the time the wall fell, more than 100 people had been killed attempting to cross, though estimates vary. Each death was mourned quietly in East Berlin, while in the West, memorials and protests condemned the regime's brutality. But the escapes were not merely physical feats. They were psychological assaults on the wall's authority. Every successful crossing struck a blow against the narrative that the barrier was impregnable. In a state that thrived on the illusion of control, even a handful of successful escapes undermined its legitimacy. The East German leadership worked tirelessly to cover up or discredit such stories, but word always leaked out. The Stasi may have been everywhere, but whispers traveled faster than surveillance. For those who remained behind, these stories carried both inspiration and dread. Inspiration because they demonstrated that freedom was possible, however slim the chance. Dread because every failed attempt was punished mercilessly. Families of escapees were interrogated, ostracized, sometimes imprisoned. Children of those who fled might be barred from higher education. The wall's cruelty lay not only in its bullets, but in its reach, punishing not just individuals, but entire families. The most haunting aspect of the escape attempts was the death strip itself, the open ground between the inner and outer walls. Sand raked daily to reveal footprints, tripwires rigged to alarms, anti-vehicle trenches, and mines made it a zone of near-certain doom. Guards and watchtowers had shoot-to-kill orders, though many later testified that they often hesitated or intentionally aimed to miss. Yet some fired, and lives were lost in the glare of the floodlights. The image of Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old bricklayer, dying in 1962 after being shot and left bleeding in the strip for nearly an hour, seared itself into global consciousness. He became a symbol of both the wall's cruelty and the world's helplessness. Yet even in failure, there was resilience. Each attempt, each sacrifice, underscored the truth that the human spirit resists captivity. The wall was supposed to crush that spirit, to convince East Germans that escape was impossible and therefore unthinkable. But the daring escapes kept proving otherwise. They showed that, against impossible odds, people would risk everything for a taste of freedom, even if it meant their lives. By the 1980s, escape stories had become folklore whispered in kitchens, sung in hidden verses, and passed among friends with awe. For East Germans, they were not just anecdotes. They were reminders that the wall, however imposing, was not eternal. For West Germans and the wider world, they were living proof of oppression's futility. The wall could kill, but it could not conquer the imagination. Tunnels, balloons, zip lines, and armored vehicles, each became a metaphor, a way of insisting that borders carved by tyranny could never fully contain the human yearning for freedom. These daring escapes were not anomalies, but precursors, cracks in the concrete facade. They foreshadowed what the world would eventually witness in 1989, the wall itself crumbling under the weight of human will. If the Berlin Wall was the iron fist of East Germany, the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security, was its all-seeing eye. The wall's concrete and barbed wire served as physical deterrents, but the Stasi's web of surveillance was the invisible cage that bound East Germans in place. Its power was not merely in what it did, but in what people believed it could do. To live under the GDR was to live in a constant state of suspicion, where every word might be overheard and every neighbor might be an informant. Founded in 1950, the Stasi quickly grew into one of the most formidable intelligence agencies in the world. By the 1980s, it employed approximately 91,000 full-time staff and cultivated a staggering 170,000 unofficial collaborators in a country of just 17 million. Statistically, that meant 1 out of every 60 East Germans was working directly or indirectly for the Stasi. In practice, the shadow of surveillance seemed to extend even further. Its primary mission was to defend the socialist state by neutralizing any threat, foreign, domestic, real, or imagined. Its agents monitored not just borders, but minds. They tapped phones, intercepted mail, and filled countless archives with meticulously written reports. Every whisper, every friendship, every joke could be cataloged, cross-referenced, and weaponized. The Stasi believed that control was best achieved not only by punishing dissent, but by preempting it, by creating a culture where dissent was never voiced at all. This was particularly true when it came to the wall. Escapes were humiliating for the regime, each successful attempt a tiny fissure in the carefully constructed facade of invulnerability. To prevent them, the Stasi wove an invisible net. Informants infiltrated neighborhoods near the border, watching for unusual behavior, someone digging at night, collecting unusual materials, or forming suspicious friendships. University students, factory workers, and even church groups were infiltrated. In some cases, friends were recruited as informants, betraying each other in exchange for small privileges or under threats of blackmail. One of the most chilling aspects of the Stasi's work was its psychological warfare, known as Zersitzung, decomposition. Rather than always resorting to direct arrests, the Stasi often sought to break individuals mentally and socially. Suspected dissidents might find their careers mysteriously derailed, their friendships poisoned by rumors, their marriages strained by anonymous letters. A misplaced passport application, a sudden denial of university admission, a quiet demotion at work. All of these could be orchestrated to isolate a person until they gave up their ambitions. It was a form of control as invisible as it was devastating. The result was a society where trust withered. Friends whispered only in forests or while walking, afraid of hidden microphones in apartments. Families sometimes avoided speaking openly in their own homes. Children were taught in schools to report suspicious behavior, even from their parents. Ordinary life became an exercise in self-censorship. The wall was guarded by soldiers and dogs, but it was reinforced daily by silence, fear, and suspicion. The Stasi's surveillance extended to the most mundane aspects of life. Ordinary citizens would be followed on errands, their trash sifted through, their laundry noted. Surveillance files grew into millions of pages, some absurdly detailed. There are documented cases of Stasi agents recording how often individuals brushed their teeth or what type of jam they preferred at breakfast. To the outside world, this level of obsession seemed absurd. But inside the GDR, it created an atmosphere where people believed they were never alone. Paranoia was not an accident, it was policy. Even churches, traditionally safe havens in times of repression, were not immune. Pastors and congregants found themselves watched, their sermons analyzed for hints of dissent. Youth groups that met under the banner of faith were infiltrated. Yet paradoxically, it was often in these very churches that the seeds of resistance began to sprout. By the 1980s, prayer groups and peace vigils became gathering points for dissidents, sheltered, though barely, by the sanctity of religious spaces. The Stasi watched, documented, and sometimes intervened, but they could not entirely extinguish the quiet courage that spread in pews and candlelit vigils. Western intelligence agencies often marveled at the Stasi's efficiency. The CIA, MI6, and other agencies facing the East during the Cold War acknowledged its reach and effectiveness. Yet, even they noted the paradox. In its obsession with controlling every detail of life, the Stasi drowned in information. Their archives became oceans of trivialities, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish true threats from daily routine. In attempting to know everything, they often understood little. Still, the psychological impact was profound. The knowledge, or even the suspicion, that someone might be watching was enough to deter action. A man considering escape might wonder if his coworker was secretly informing on him. A woman confiding her desire to leave might hesitate, fearing her closest friend could betray her. The Stasi did not need to catch everyone. They only needed enough visible examples to keep the rest subdued. For those who were caught, the consequences were grim. Prisons like Hohenschönhausen in East Berlin became notorious for their interrogations. Prisoners described endless psychological games, lights left on for days, sleep deprivation, threats against their families. Some were offered release in exchange for becoming informants themselves, perpetuating the cycle of fear. Others were quietly sold to the West, as part of an unofficial arrangement where West Germany paid ransom for political prisoners. It was a perverse trade, turning human suffering into hard currency for the GDR. And yet, for all its strength, the Stasi was not invincible. Its very omnipresence bred quiet defiance. People developed small acts of resistance, whispering jokes about the regime, listening to banned Western music, or watching smuggled television broadcasts. Each act was dangerous, yet each also chipped away at the narrative of total control. Over time, these acts accumulated into something larger, a recognition that no wall, no matter how high or how well guarded, could imprison the entirety of human hope. Looking back, it is easy to see the Stasi as an unstoppable machine, but it was not. It was composed of ordinary people, many of whom were coerced, manipulated, or themselves fearful. Its power was real, but it was also brittle. When the wall finally fell in 1989, the Stasi collapsed almost overnight. Its archives were stormed by citizens, its secrets laid bare, its fearsome aura shattered. What had once seemed eternal dissolved into paper and dust. In that moment, East Germans discovered something profound. The watchers in the shadows had been more afraid of them than they had realized. The Stasi had spent decades trying to control a population, but in the end, it was the population's refusal to be silent that brought the system down. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the collapse of concrete, but the triumph of human voices over enforced silence. To understand the power of the Berlin Wall, one must see it not just as a barrier dividing a city, but as a line carved into the heart of the Cold War itself. Few structures in human history have so vividly embodied the clash of ideologies. On one side, capitalism and liberal democracy, and on the other, communism and authoritarian socialism. The wall was more than concrete and barbed wire. It was the stage upon which the drama of the 20th century played out. By the early 1960s, Berlin had become the ultimate flashpoint in the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The city, situated deep inside East Germany yet divided into Western and Soviet zones, was a constant source of friction. For the West, West Berlin symbolized freedom and resilience, a democratic island in a sea of authoritarianism. For the East, its very existence was an embarrassment, a bleeding wound that tempted citizens to flee and exposed the hollowness of the socialist experiment. When the wall went up in August 1961, the world understood instantly what it meant. Families were separated overnight. Streets that once flowed freely were cut in half. Soldiers stood ready, weapons loaded, across tense checkpoints. It was a declaration not only to East Germans, but to the entire globe. The ideological divide was no longer a metaphor. It was reality in brick and steel. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy faced a delicate balance. He did not want to concede Berlin to the Soviets, but he also understood that to directly challenge the wall militarily would risk nuclear confrontation. His famous visit to Berlin in 1963, where he proclaimed Ich bin ein Berliner, was more than rhetoric. It was a declaration that the West would not abandon this city. Standing before crowds of hundreds of thousands, Kennedy's words became a rallying cry, reminding Berliners that though they were encircled, they were not alone. Meanwhile, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev framed the wall as a protective barrier against Western infiltration. He called it an anti-fascist bulwark, casting it as a defense against NATO rather than an imprisonment of his own people. Yet the imagery told another story. Photographs of families waving across barbed wire, of tanks facing each other at Checkpoint Charlie, and of desperate escape attempts circulated globally. Each escape, whether successful or tragic, was splashed across newspapers, a silent rebuke to the claim that socialism was a worker's paradise. The wall quickly became a symbol in art, music, and politics. Western propaganda highlighted its brutality, the death strip with its sand traps, watchtowers, and guard dogs. The East attempted to reframe it as a matter of security and peace. But no amount of official language could obscure its human cost. When Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old East German, was shot and left to bleed to death near Checkpoint Charlie in 1962, the world was horrified. His cries for help, ignored by East German guards, and the inability of Western forces just meters away to intervene, crystallized the wall's cruelty. Internationally, Berlin became the most visible scar of the Cold War. Diplomats, presidents, and prime ministers often visited its western half, standing before the wall to denounce communism. Perhaps the most famous of these moments came in 1987, when President Ronald Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate and demanded, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." To some, it sounded like political theater. Yet 2 years later, the words would seem almost prophetic. The wall also tested alliances. West Germany, led by Chancellor Willy Brandt, pursued Ostpolitik in the late 1960s and 1970s, an attempt to normalize relations with East Germany and the wider Eastern Bloc. While controversial, this policy reduced tensions and fostered small openings, such as limited family visits across the wall. Still, the physical barrier remained unmoved, a reminder that reconciliation had limits under Soviet rule. Beyond politics, the wall shaped the very psychology of East and West. In the West, it became a rallying symbol of resistance against tyranny. In the East, it bred despair but also resilience. Ordinary citizens adapted, building lives in the shadow of a border that was both absurd and terrifying. Over time, however, its presence also revealed a truth the East German state wished to hide. If the system was so desirable, why was such a massive wall needed to keep its people inside? The Cold War itself was marked by cycles of tension and thaw, Cuban Missile Crises, nuclear arms races, détente, and renewed hostility. Yet through all of it, the wall stood unmoved, a grim constant. To school children in the United States, it was an easy illustration of what they were told was at stake. To citizens in the Soviet bloc, it was proof of the limits imposed on them by their governments. For nearly 3 decades, Berlin became a diplomatic pressure cooker. Each small change, a new restriction, a new agreement, a new protest, carried the risk of escalation. Military standoffs at checkpoints were rare but tense, as heavily armed soldiers from NATO and the Warsaw Pact glared at one another across meters of asphalt. In those moments, the wall was more than a German problem. It was the front line of a potential world war. And yet, history has a strange way of turning symbols into their opposites. The wall, built to show strength, became a symbol of weakness. The very fact of its existence was an admission that East Germany could not hold its people willingly. The greater the repression, the greater the curiosity from abroad, and the greater the dissatisfaction within. The wall was a prison, but it was also a mirror, reflecting the insecurity of the regime that built it. By the 1980s, cracks in the communist bloc were beginning to show. Poland's solidarity movement, Hungary's cautious reforms, and Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika signaled winds of change. Yet the wall still stood, as if it alone could resist history's tide. It loomed over East Berlin, its graffiti-covered western side mocking the gray emptiness of the East, a physical metaphor of the contrast between freedom and control. To walk near it, to hear its silence broken only by the sound of guards' boots, was to feel the Cold War in one's bones. This was not an abstract struggle of ideologies. It was stone, steel, and human suffering. Each day the wall remained. It reminded the world of what was at stake in the confrontation between superpowers. But what no one foresaw was how suddenly that confrontation would crumble, not with missiles or tanks, but with a bureaucratic slip of the tongue that would spark an avalanche. For nearly 30 years, the wall stood as the Cold War's most tangible monument. Yet in 1989, it would fall not to bombs or treaties, but to the people it imprisoned and the mistakes of those who guarded it. The wall's story, while rooted in geopolitics, was always about human beings, and human beings have a way of breaking barriers no ideology can hold forever. When the Berlin Wall rose in 1961, it did not merely slice a city in half. It carved daily existence into 2 unequal realities. For East Berliners, life became an intricate dance of compromise, adaptation, and quiet resistance. Their world was shaped by shortages and state control, but also by small triumphs of ingenuity, humor, and endurance. The wall was not only a border between states, it was a backdrop to ordinary lives lived under extraordinary circumstances. The East German state, officially known as the German Democratic Republic, GDR, presented itself as a socialist success story. Billboards and newspapers trumpeted slogans about equality, progress, and solidarity. Workers were hailed as the vanguard of history, and the government boasted about social benefits, guaranteed employment, subsidized housing, free education, and healthcare. To the outside world, the GDR framed itself as a model of fairness compared to the capitalist West, where unemployment and poverty supposedly still haunted millions. Yet for those inside, the reality was far more complex. The wall symbolized not only political repression, but also a narrowing of horizons. Suddenly, grandparents could no longer visit their grandchildren across town. Childhood friendships ended overnight. Families were torn apart by geography and ideology, their lives reduced to letters censored by state officials and rare supervised visits. Every absence was a wound, and every reunion, when it occurred, was bittersweet. Daily life in East Germany revolved around shortages. Queues were a constant feature of the urban landscape. People lined up for butter, for oranges, for toilet paper, for whatever the state-run shops happened to offer that day. Coffee was a luxury, often rationed or replaced with substitutes made of roasted barley or chicory. Bananas became mythical. When they appeared, mothers rushed to secure them, often buying extra to mash for their children. West Germans would later joke about the East's obsession with bananas, but for those who lived through it, the fruit symbolized the everyday indignities of socialism. Housing was another challenge. Although the government built large blocks of prefabricated concrete apartments, known as Plattenbau, demand always exceeded supply. Young couples often waited years for their own flat, sometimes forced to live with parents or in cramped communal arrangements. These concrete towers, gray and repetitive, dotted the East German landscape, becoming symbols of both socialist ambition and monotony. Inside, families did their best to make homes cheerful, decorating with colorful fabrics, hand-sewn curtains, and carefully tended houseplants. Propaganda was inescapable. Every aspect of culture was shaped to reflect loyalty to the state. Schools emphasized socialist history and ideology, teaching children to admire the Soviet Union and distrust the West. Young people joined organizations like the Free German Youth, FDJ, where loyalty songs and parades instilled collective discipline. Television offered carefully censored programming, though many secretly tuned into West German broadcasts if their antennas could catch the signal. To watch West TV was technically illegal, yet it became a quiet rebellion in countless households, offering glimpses of consumer goods, freedom of speech, and music scenes that East Berliners could only dream about. Music, in fact, was one of the key outlets of resistance. Western rock and pop, from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones, circulated despite official bans. Records were smuggled in, and young people copied them onto makeshift tapes, creating underground networks of forbidden sound. To own such music was to taste a kind of freedom. To dance to it was to imagine another world. Food and housing shortages bred a culture of improvisation. East Germans learned to fix old appliances again and again, creating a thriving, unofficial repair culture. They developed inventive recipes from limited ingredients, turning cabbage into countless variations of meals. Cars were a particularly stark example of scarcity. The most common vehicle was the Trabant, a small, smoky, two-stroke engine car made of plastic-like material. To acquire one often required waiting 10 or 15 years after placing an order. Yet families proudly treasured their Trabi, painting it bright colors or packing it with friends for road trips within the Eastern Bloc. It was clunky, slow, and polluting, but it was freedom on wheels, at least within approved borders. The state, however, watched everything. The Ministry for State Security, known as the Stasi, built one of the most extensive surveillance networks in the world. Millions of citizens were monitored, and countless informants reported on their neighbors, colleagues, even family members. Conversations at work or in cafes could be dangerous. A casual remark criticizing the government might find its way into a file that followed someone for years. Careers were blocked, travel permits denied, lives quietly ruined by the unseen reach of state suspicion. Yet even under such scrutiny, people found ways to carve out spaces of privacy and resistance. Jokes about the government, dark, witty, whispered in kitchens, circulated widely. Humor became a weapon, a subtle way to defy a system that demanded conformity. Families created their own sanctuaries behind closed doors, places where they could speak more freely, laugh, or secretly watch Western programs. In these intimate spaces, East Germans preserved their dignity, refusing to surrender every corner of their lives. Religion, too, played a surprising role. While the state promoted atheism, churches became rare havens of independent thought and organization. In the 1980s, Protestant churches in particular provided meeting spaces for dissidents, environmentalists, and peace activists. What began as prayer meetings often grew into political gatherings, laying the groundwork for protests that would later shake the regime. Education and work life followed strict ideological guidelines, but they also carried a certain stability. Employment was guaranteed, and few people went hungry. The GDR invested heavily in women's participation in the workforce, and childcare was widely available. For many, there was a sense of equality in the drab sameness. People joked that while the East lacked variety, at least everyone lacked equally. The irony was bitter, but it reflected a truth. Hardship was normalized, and solidarity softened its edges. Travel restrictions were perhaps the most painful limitation. While citizens of the West could roam the globe, East Germans were confined mostly within the Eastern Bloc. Trips to Hungary, Poland, or Czechoslovakia were possible, but journeys to the West were nearly impossible without special permission. The wall became the ever-present reminder of this lost freedom. Some tried to escape, digging tunnels, hiding in cars, even flying homemade hot air balloons. Those who succeeded became legends. Those who failed often paid with their lives. And yet, despite the shortages, the surveillance, and the censorship, life went on. Children played in courtyards, parents cooked family meals, couples fell in love, and communities built bonds of friendship and trust. These human rhythms endured even as the wall loomed nearby. To live in East Berlin was to carry a dual consciousness, outwardly conforming to survive, inwardly holding onto dreams of something freer. By the 1980s, dissatisfaction had grown. The economy lagged, consumer goods were outdated, and comparisons with West Germany became impossible to ignore. Relatives visiting from the West brought gifts, jeans, coffee, chocolate, that highlighted the contrast. Every Western object, from a glossy magazine to a Walkman, seemed to hum with forbidden promise. The gap between ideology and reality widened with each passing year. In the shadow of the wall, life was a paradox, limited yet resilient, gray yet colorful in hidden corners. The wall controlled movement, but it could not fully extinguish imagination. The state dictated reality, but families and individuals wove their own quiet truths. Even in oppression, the human spirit sought small freedoms. Through music, laughter, whispered jokes, and stubborn survival. The wall tried to define East German lives, but those who lived beneath its shadow never stopped redefining what it meant to endure. In the end, it would be their quiet persistence, their daily defiance through living, that made the wall's fall inevitable. To live in East Germany was to live under the gaze of an invisible colossus. The Ministry for State Security, known universally as the Stasi, was not merely a secret police. It was a sprawling system of surveillance that seeped into every crevice of daily life. If the Berlin Wall was the most visible barrier of the Cold War, then the Stasi was its most suffocating shadow. The wall kept people in. The Stasi kept them obedient. Founded in 1950, only a year after the GDR itself, the Stasi quickly grew into one of the most formidable intelligence organizations in history. At its peak, it employed nearly 100,000 full-time staff and controlled a staggering network of more than 170,000 unofficial informants. In a country of just 17 million people, this meant that 1 in every 50 East Germans was reporting on others. Neighbors, coworkers, even family members could secretly be on the payroll. Trust itself became a dangerous luxury. The Stasi's methods were insidiously thorough. They tapped telephones, intercepted letters, and planted listening devices in homes, hotels, and offices. They perfected the art of psychological harassment, a method known as Zersitzung, literally decomposition. Rather than openly arresting or torturing dissidents, the Stasi often chose to quietly dismantle their lives. They spread rumors to ruin reputations, sabotage careers, denied university placements, or quietly destroyed marriages through orchestrated suspicions. The goal was to isolate individuals, to make them feel abandoned and powerless without ever setting foot inside a prison cell. Yet prison was always an option, and the threat of it hovered like a silent specter. The Stasi maintained interrogation centers across East Germany, most notoriously in Berlin's Hohenschönhausen prison, a facility so secret it did not appear on maps. Prisoners often vanished without explanation, whisked away in unmarked vans, their families left to wonder. Inside, interrogation was relentless, designed not only to extract information but to break the will. Some detainees were forced to pace for hours in tiny cells, never allowed to sit or sleep. Others were subjected to endless questioning under blinding lights. Physical violence was rare compared to earlier eras of repression, but the psychological pressure was immense. The Stasi operated not only domestically but also abroad, running a vast espionage network that rivaled the KGB. Its foreign intelligence wing infiltrated NATO, West German government agencies, and even activist groups in Western Europe. Markus Wolf, the legendary spymaster who led the Foreign Division for decades, became known as the man without a face, because Western intelligence agencies could not even secure a photograph of him for years. The reach of the Stasi extended far beyond the wall, reminding East Germans that even escape did not guarantee freedom. For ordinary citizens, the presence of the Stasi was less about direct encounters than about an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion. People learned to self-censor, to watch their words even at family dinners, to guard opinions in classrooms, to weigh every letter they wrote. The uncertainty, who might be listening, was more powerful than any overt act of repression. By planting the possibility of surveillance everywhere, the Stasi achieved near-total control without needing to exercise it at every moment. And yet, within this culture of fear, contradictions festered. While the Stasi presented itself as a defender of socialism, protecting the people from enemies of the state, its true function was to protect the regime from its own citizens. The very scale of its operations revealed a profound insecurity at the heart of East Germany. A government confident in its legitimacy would not require 1 in 50 citizens to spy on the others. The omnipresence of informants corroded the fabric of society. Friendships fractured when betrayals came to light. Years later, after the wall fell and Stasi files were opened, countless East Germans discovered with shock that their neighbors, colleagues, even spouses had been informants. These revelations shattered communities. Children learned that their fathers had reported on them. Lovers discovered betrayals embedded in their most intimate conversations. The Stasi's legacy was not only political oppression, but also a long trail of broken trust that lingered long after the regime collapsed. Yet for all its reach, the Stasi was not omnipotent. In the 1980s, as dissent quietly grew, cracks began to show. Churches, student groups, and underground movements learned to exploit the sheer size of the surveillance apparatus. With so many informants and so much information flowing in, the Stasi struggled to process it all. Files multiplied, filling warehouses with paper, but analysis lagged. The machinery of control became bloated, sometimes missing the very sparks of resistance it sought to smother. Moreover, the methods of Zersitzung, while devastating, could not extinguish every form of dissent. Artists painted allegories of repression, musicians wrote songs layered with subtle criticism, and citizens gathered in prayer circles that transformed into protests. Fear was powerful, but it could not fully crush the human impulse to resist. Each whisper of defiance was a crack in the edifice. Each small act of courage was a reminder that control was never absolute. The paradox of the Stasi was that it sought to prevent instability, but ultimately sowed the seeds of its own downfall. By fostering distrust, it weakened the social cohesion the regime claimed to uphold. By surveilling relentlessly, it revealed its insecurity rather than its strength. And by attempting to silence dissent, it amplified the yearning for freedom. When the wall finally fell in 1989, citizens stormed Stasi headquarters in Berlin and other cities, desperate to seize and preserve the files before they could be destroyed. The scene was both chaotic and symbolic. Ordinary people tearing into the archives of their oppressors, reclaiming the truth of their own lives. The sheer volume of documents, millions upon millions of pages, testified to the suffocating scope of surveillance. But the act of opening those files marked the first step toward healing, a confrontation with betrayal, and an attempt to restore trust in a society long deprived of it. Life under the Stasi was life lived in a hall of mirrors, where nothing could be fully trusted and everything might be observed. And yet, despite the suffocation, people found ways to endure, to resist in small ways, to keep alive private spaces of laughter, music, and dreams. The Stasi may have had eyes that never blinked, but it never succeeded in closing the human spirit entirely. In the end, the Stasi did not prevent the collapse of the GDR. If anything, it hastened it, for its very existence reminded citizens every day of their lack of freedom. The wall was concrete, but the Stasi was psychological cement, meant to harden society into obedience. Yet when the first cracks appeared, both wall and surveillance state crumbled under the weight of their own contradictions. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, East Germany appeared, at least on the surface, to be a tightly controlled society. The wall loomed unbroken, the Stasi's grip remained firm, and the state seemed secure in its command over every aspect of life. Yet beneath this rigid facade, small currents of discontent began to flow, gathering strength in places the regime could not entirely suppress, most notably within the walls of churches. Ironically, the very socialist state that sought to banish religion found itself outmaneuvered by the persistence of faith. In East Germany, the Protestant Church had been one of the few institutions not fully absorbed into the machinery of the state. It was tolerated partly out of necessity, partly because its destruction would have been too costly, both domestically and internationally. As a result, churches became sanctuaries, not only for prayer, but for ideas. Throughout the 1980s, these sacred spaces began hosting gatherings that stretched beyond worship. Environmental groups, peace activists, and young people yearning for freedom found refuge in church halls. Discussions about nuclear disarmament, censorship, and ecological decay were cloaked in the language of morality, but everyone present understood that these were conversations about something deeper, the suffocating limits of life under the regime. The flicker of candlelight during prayer vigils was more than religious ritual. It was a subtle signal of resistance. Leipzig, a city in eastern Saxony, became the epicenter of this quiet revolution. The Nikolaikirche, St. Nicholas Church, opened its doors weekly for prayers for peace. At first, these gatherings were small, attended by a handful of activists and faithful congregants. But over time, the numbers grew. By the mid-1980s, hundreds of people were filling the pews, praying, singing hymns, and speaking about peace, justice, and human dignity. The Stasi, ever watchful, infiltrated these meetings, taking notes and identifying participants. Yet even their presence could not quench the momentum. In fact, the surveillance often underscored the very injustices being denounced. It was not only religion that animated dissent, it was a sense of exhaustion. By the 1980s, East Germany's economy was faltering. Consumer goods were scarce, the quality of life lagged far behind the West, and people grew weary of the constant shortages, the long queues, the drab monotony. Television signals from West Germany slipped through despite the state's attempts at censorship, and East Germans glimpsed the other side. Vibrant commercials, bustling cities, and promises of abundance. The contrast was stark, and it fueled a quiet rage. Youth culture, too, became a breeding ground for dissent. Rock bands, punk groups, and underground artists found ways to mock the regime, sometimes with lyrics coded in metaphor, sometimes with raw defiance. Young people gathered in basements, at clandestine concerts, or around church-organized events, seeking both music and meaning. For them, rebellion was not necessarily organized politics. It was the act of carving out space to breathe freely. The Stasi responded with predictable ferocity, infiltrating youth groups, banning songs, and harassing musicians. Yet every act of repression only deepened the allure of rebellion. The more the regime tried to control expression, the more young people craved outlets beyond its grasp. In this struggle of wills, repression paradoxically sowed the seeds of resistance. Meanwhile, East Germany's environmental situation provided another rallying point. Industrial pollution choked rivers and skies, especially around Leipzig and Bitterfeld, where chemical plants belched smoke and waste with little regulation. Citizens saw their children coughing, their water undrinkable, their forests dying from acid rain. The government, eager to maintain production quotas, downplayed or concealed the crisis. But within church circles, environmental groups documented the damage, distributed leaflets, and called for accountability. These green movements grew in strength, linking ecological disaster to the larger failure of the socialist system. What made these movements so powerful was not just their critique, but their ability to coalesce. The churches became the connective tissue linking disparate groups, peace activists, environmentalists, youth dissidents, and human rights advocates. They created networks of trust in a society where trust had been systematically eroded by surveillance. In candlelit vigils and whispered conversations, people found courage in solidarity. By the mid-1980s, whispers of reform began to ripple across the Eastern Bloc. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, born in the shipyards of Gdansk, challenged communist authority and inspired others. In Hungary, cautious reforms loosened restrictions. And in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, shaking the ideological foundations of the Cold War. East Germans watched these developments closely. Some saw hope, others feared retribution. The GDR leadership, under Erich Honecker, chose repression over reform, insisting that East Germany would chart its own path, separate from Gorbachev's new course. But history was already moving faster than Honecker could control. The turning point came when small protests began to spill out of the churches and into the streets. In Leipzig, after Monday prayers, congregants would walk outside holding candles, sometimes in silence, sometimes singing hymns. The gatherings were peaceful but unmistakably political. The slogans were simple yet profound. "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. The message was clear: the regime no longer spoke for them. At first, the state responded with intimidation. Police surrounded churches, blocked exits, and arrested organizers. Yet the protests persisted. Each week, more people joined. Each week, the courage grew. By the late 1980s, what had begun as small vigils had swelled into thousands marching through Leipzig streets. The sight was extraordinary. Citizens holding candles, facing down armored police, refusing to be silenced. The regime had guns, but the people had numbers. And, crucially, the world was watching. The 1980s descent did not topple the wall overnight, but it weakened its foundations. It created spaces of freedom where none had existed. It gave East Germans the language of resistance and the networks of solidarity they would need in 1989. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the wall, though seemingly impenetrable, was vulnerable, not to bombs or bulldozers, but to human persistence and collective courage. History often remembers revolutions as sudden explosions. But the fall of the Berlin Wall was preceded by years of patient, quiet defiance, by prayers whispered in churches, by songs sung in basements, by leaflets passed hand to hand, by candles held in trembling hands on cold Leipzig nights. These were the first cracks, invisible at first, but destined to widen until the entire structure collapsed. While dissent simmered in East Germany, the broader stage of the Cold War was undergoing seismic change. The wall may have stood in Berlin, but it was always more than a local barrier. It was the physical embodiment of global rivalry. Every decision made in Washington, Moscow, Warsaw, or Budapest reverberated through the streets of East Berlin and Leipzig. By the 1980s, those reverberations had grown so powerful that they began to shake the very foundations of the German Democratic Republic. In 1983, U.S. President Ronald Reagan traveled to West Berlin and stood near the Brandenburg Gate, delivering one of the most famous challenges of the Cold War. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was a line heavy with symbolism, addressed not only to the Soviet leader, but to the millions trapped behind concrete and barbed wire. Reagan's words echoed across the globe, carried into living rooms, newspapers, and radios. For East Germans who heard them, the phrase was both hope and provocation. For their leaders, it was a reminder that the world was watching and waiting for cracks in the Iron Curtain. But the true pivot did not come from Washington alone. It came from Moscow. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Unlike his predecessors, he recognized that the Soviet Empire was crumbling under its own weight. Economically stagnant, politically brittle, and morally exhausted. Gorbachev introduced policies that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier: glasnost, or openness, which encouraged debate and transparency, and perestroika, or restructuring, which sought to modernize the stagnant Soviet economy. For the Kremlin, these reforms were born of desperation. But for Eastern Europe, they were dynamite. Suddenly, the ideological glue that bound the Eastern Bloc together began to soften. Once Moscow hinted that it would no longer use tanks to crush dissent. What became known as the Sinatra Doctrine, allowing nations to do it their way, the iron grip loosened. The message spread quickly. The Soviets would not intervene as they had in Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. The protective umbrella that East German leaders relied upon was quietly withdrawn. This shift emboldened reform movements across the region. In Poland, solidarity gained traction, leading to semi-free elections in 1989 that effectively dismantled communist rule there. In Hungary, barbed wire along the border with Austria was cut, creating the first real opening in the Iron Curtain. Czechoslovakia prepared for what would later be called the Velvet Revolution. One by one, the dominoes of Eastern Europe began to wobble. East Germany was not yet ready to fall, but its isolation was growing untenable. Meanwhile, West Germany seized every opportunity to remind the world of the absurdity of division. Chancellor Helmut Kohl spoke of unity, human rights, and reconciliation. West German television stations broadcast stories of East German hardship, creating a constant comparison that gnawed at the minds of those in the East. The contrast between the consumer abundance of the West and the shortages of the East was not just material, it was existential. Each advertisement for a new car or a household appliance broadcast across the invisible airwaves was a reminder that another life was possible, just a few kilometers away. The East German leadership, under Erich Honecker, clung desperately to orthodoxy. Honecker dismissed Gorbachev's reforms as dangerous, insisting that the GDR was strong and secure, a model of socialism that needed no change. But this obstinacy revealed weakness more than strength. While neighbors experimented with reform, East Germany doubled down on repression, ensuring that when change came, it would come all at once. The irony was that international pressure worked in tandem with internal exhaustion. On one hand, world leaders demanded reform, human rights, and freedom of movement. On the other, East German citizens, inspired by Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, began to believe that change might actually be possible. It was no longer unthinkable to imagine a different future. The wall, once seen as eternal, began to appear fragile. Symbolism played its role as powerfully as politics. When Reagan gave his Brandenburg Gate speech, the wall was still standing tall. But 6 years later, in 1989, it was rubble. Reagan's challenge did not topple the wall on its own, but it entered the cultural bloodstream of resistance. In Leipzig, in East Berlin, in Dresden, the words became shorthand for a dream deferred but not forgotten. In September 1989, Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a breach in the Iron Curtain. East Germans, seizing the opportunity, fled en masse through Hungary into the West. Pictures of families carrying suitcases across the border filled newspapers worldwide, sending a clear message. East Germans were voting with their feet. Each departure was an act of defiance, each suitcase a rejection of the system. Honecker's regime tried to downplay the exodus, but it was impossible to ignore. The wall had been built to stop precisely this kind of movement. Now, even without bulldozers, it was failing in its purpose. Diplomatic pressures compounded the crisis. Western leaders demanded clarity from the East German regime. Would it reform, or would it collapse? Gorbachev himself, during a 1989 visit to East Berlin for the GDR's 40th anniversary, delivered a thinly veiled warning. Life punishes those who come too late. East Germans cheered him in the streets, not their own leaders. Honecker was visibly rattled. The Soviet shield was gone, and the people sensed it. International media amplified the story. Satellite networks, photographers, and foreign correspondents reported every protest, every march, every arrest. Images of Leipzig's Monday demonstrations reached viewers worldwide. East German authorities, once able to control the narrative, now found themselves outpaced by technology and global attention. The world was bearing witness, and the regime could not silence it. In many ways, the wall's collapse was scripted not only by the protests in Leipzig or Berlin, but by the geopolitical theater unfolding across continents. The Soviet Union was too weak to intervene. The United States was too confident to back down. Western Europe was too prosperous to ignore its divided half. And East Germans themselves had grown too weary, too informed, too bold to remain silent. The interplay between internal courage and external pressure created a perfect storm. Without the dissent of churches, activists, and ordinary citizens, there would have been no movement to support. But without the shifting winds of the Cold War, Gorbachev's reforms, Hungary's open border, Poland's elections, Reagan's rhetoric, East Germans might never have believed victory was possible. By the autumn of 1989, East Germany stood at a precipice. Its leadership was isolated internationally, despised domestically, and abandoned by its Soviet patron. Its people were marching in the streets by the tens of thousands. Its neighbors were dismantling the Iron Curtain. The wall was still standing physically, but politically it was already crumbling. The next chapters of history would not be written in smoke-filled conference rooms or behind closed doors in Moscow. They would be written in the streets of Leipzig and the squares of Berlin, carried by chants, candles, and the sheer momentum of change. By the autumn of 1989, the pressure inside East Germany had reached a breaking point, and nowhere was this more visible than in the city of Leipzig. Known for its trade fairs, music, and history, Leipzig would become the unlikely epicenter of a revolution that toppled one of the most repressive regimes in Europe. In its streets, thousands gathered not with guns or barricades, but with candles and prayers. Theirs was a movement rooted in moral courage, and it would reverberate throughout the entire Eastern Bloc. The stage for the uprising was set at St. Nicholas Church, a Baroque sanctuary that had stood since the 12th century. Under the leadership of Pastor Christian Führer, the church began hosting Friedensgebet, or prayers for peace, every Monday evening. These gatherings were initially small, attended by a handful of dissidents, church members, and pacifists. But as political tension grew, so did the attendance. By the late 1980s, the Monday prayers became a rallying point for citizens desperate for change. At first, the regime tolerated the gatherings, assuming they would dissipate. But instead, they multiplied. What began in Leipzig spread to other cities. In Dresden, Berlin, and Jena, churches filled with people yearning for freedom, reform, and dignity. They sang hymns, carried banners, and lit candles, symbols of hope in a country suffocated by fear. The gatherings were not violent, but they were profoundly subversive. In a society where even small acts of dissent were punished, to stand together publicly was an act of rebellion. The East German authorities, alarmed by the growing numbers, attempted to crack down. In September 1989, police and the notorious Stasi security service began arresting demonstrators. Protesters were beaten, interrogated, and threatened. The state flooded the streets with uniformed officers and plainclothes informants. The message was clear. Dissent would not be tolerated. Yet the marches grew larger. Instead of breaking the movement, repression fed it. Each arrest produced more outrage, each crackdown more resolve. The turning point came on October 9, 1989. Tension in Leipzig was electric. Rumors swirled that the state was preparing a massacre akin to Tiananmen Square earlier that year. Factories were closed early, hospitals were put on alert, and units of riot police and soldiers surrounded the city. Loudspeakers warned citizens to stay home. Yet as evening fell, more than 70,000 people streamed into the city center. They carried no weapons. Their only defense was the light of candles, the solidarity of their chants, and the determination etched into their faces. The fear was palpable. Many expected that night to end in bloodshed. Mothers kissed their children goodbye as if for the last time. Fathers carried letters in their pockets, hastily written farewells in case they were arrested or killed. The state had declared its readiness to crush dissent with force, and Leipzig was prepared to pay the price for freedom. And then, the miracle. The order to fire never came. Police and soldiers stood tense, but they did not act. Instead of blood, there was silence, and then chants. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. The slogan carried through the streets like thunder, both a declaration of unity and a direct challenge to the regime. It was not whispered in secret, but shouted in defiance. For the first time, the people had faced down the state and won. The events of October 9th sent shockwaves through East Germany and beyond. The regime had blinked. Fear, the essential tool of dictatorship, had been shattered. The following Monday, the numbers swelled to 120,000. The Monday after that, 500,000 marched. What began as prayers in a small church had grown into a tidal wave of resistance, and Leipzig was its beating heart. The movement spread rapidly. In Dresden, protests erupted around the main train station, where thousands of East Germans attempted to board trains bound for the West. In East Berlin, demonstrators gathered at Alexanderplatz, demanding reforms and resignations. In smaller towns and cities, people filled their squares, inspired by the courage of Leipzig. The government could no longer contain the dissent. It was too widespread, too organized, and too peaceful to crush without provoking total collapse. The slogans evolved as the movement grew. "We are the people" soon became "We are one people," a direct call for reunification with West Germany. Banners demanded free elections, freedom of the press, and an end to the dictatorship. The protests were no longer just about reforming socialism. They were about dismantling it. International media played a crucial role in amplifying the movement. Western television networks broadcast footage of candlelit marches, chanting crowds, and the crumbling authority of the state. These images crossed borders, inspiring solidarity abroad and fueling resolve at home. The East German government tried to block the broadcasts, but information seeped in regardless. People knew they were not alone, and that knowledge was transformative. Inside the ruling Socialist Unity Party, SED, panic spread. Erich Honecker, the longtime leader, insisted on repression, but his hardline stance was increasingly untenable. Even his allies saw the writing on the wall. Within weeks, Honecker was forced to resign, replaced by Egon Krenz, a man who promised reforms but delivered little. The people were no longer willing to wait. The tide of history had turned, and no leader could stand against it. The Leipzig marches revealed something fundamental about human courage, that tyranny thrives only as long as fear outweighs hope. On October 9, 1989, hope surpassed fear, and with that, the regime lost its grip. What followed was inevitable. The Monday marches became a ritual, each week larger than the last, until the regime faced millions demanding change. The wall still stood in Berlin, but its days were numbered. For decades, East Germany had maintained its rule through control, intimidation, and the illusion of permanence. The Leipzig marches destroyed that illusion. Ordinary people, students, factory workers, parents, pastors, proved that change could be achieved without violence. They proved that a dictatorship, however brutal, could not withstand the united will of its people. By November 1989, the energy unleashed in Leipzig would sweep across the entire country, culminating in the most iconic night of the 20th century, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it was in the streets of Leipzig, under the glow of candlelight and the echo of chants, that the revolution was born. The heart of East Germany was its capital, East Berlin, a city divided not just by bricks and barbed wire, but by the daily rituals of life and repression. For decades, East Berliners had lived in the shadow of the wall, its looming presence a constant reminder of what they had lost. Family connections severed, opportunities denied, and a city split into two worlds. Yet even in this city, where the state's grip was strongest and the Stasi's eye most watchful, change began to stir. The cracks that had spread across Leipzig's streets now reached the capital. For years, East Berlin had been the showcase of the socialist state. The broad avenues, the monumental architecture, and the parades along Karl Marx Allee were meant to project strength and permanence. The regime carefully choreographed the capital, ensuring that visitors from abroad saw not oppression, but the supposed triumph of socialism. But beneath the polished surface, discontent simmered. East Berliners were not blind to the prosperity of their Western neighbors. From certain vantage points, they could see West Berlin directly. The flashing neon lights, the abundance in shop windows, the movement of free people across bustling streets. West Berlin became more than a city. It was a vision of what life could be, tantalizingly close yet impossibly far. The Stasi presence in East Berlin was suffocating. Thousands of informants reported on neighbors, friends, and even family members. A whispered joke could lead to interrogation. A slip of the tongue could mean career ruin. People lived with a dual consciousness, the private self and the public self, carefully separated to avoid punishment. This pervasive fear made open protest nearly unthinkable. For decades, the wall seemed unshakable because East Berliners believed resistance was futile. But 1989 had changed everything. The example of Leipzig proved that mass protest was possible without immediate slaughter. News of the Monday marches spread quickly, even in the tightly controlled capital. Despite government attempts to censor it, rumors, whispers, and smuggled images fueled the courage of East Berliners. Slowly, cautiously, they began to gather. By late October, the city's squares filled with small groups of demonstrators. At first, they were hesitant, holding candles, murmuring slogans, scattering when police approached. But each week, the gatherings grew bolder. On November 4th, 1989, the turning point arrived. In Alexanderplatz, East Berlin's vast central square, more than 500,000 people assembled in open defiance of the regime. It was the largest demonstration in East German history, and it occurred not in Leipzig or Dresden, but in the very heart of the capital. The atmosphere that day was electric, charged with both fear and exhilaration. Banners waved above the crowd, freedom and democracy, down with the wall, we are the people. Speakers, including artists, writers, and even disillusioned members of the ruling Socialist Unity Party, addressed the masses. They called for reform, accountability, and freedom of speech. What was once unutterable was now shouted openly into the air of Alexanderplatz, echoing off the facades of government buildings. The Stasi and police stood by, uncertain. The regime was paralyzed, caught between fear of international condemnation and its instinct for repression. The sheer size of the demonstration made violent suppression almost unthinkable. 500,000 voices could not be silenced without igniting a catastrophe. For the first time, East Berliners looked directly into the face of their rulers and found them powerless. The symbolism of Alexanderplatz could not be overstated. For decades, it had been the site of parades glorifying socialism, where the state showcased its military and economic might. Now, the same square belonged to the people. It was no longer a stage for the regime, but for rebellion. The images broadcast around the world, candles held high, chants filling the air, made it clear that East Germany's days were numbered. Within the ruling elite, panic deepened. Egon Krenz, who had replaced Honecker in October, attempted to calm the storm with promises of reform. But his words rang hollow. People no longer trusted speeches, they demanded action. Krenz offered cosmetic changes, loosening travel restrictions, discussing limited freedoms, but it was too late. The population had awakened, and the momentum was unstoppable. Inside East Berlin, the mood shifted rapidly. People who once feared to speak out now joined marches. Families who had long kept their frustrations private now carried banners in the streets. What had been a city of whispers became a city of voices. Even those within the government apparatus sensed the tide. Some police officers looked the other way. Some Stasi agents quietly sympathized. Authority was dissolving, not through a single act, but through the erosion of fear. The days after Alexanderplatz saw an explosion of civic action. Citizens formed grassroots groups, debating the future of East Germany. Independent newspapers appeared, printing manifestos and demands. Political prisoners were released. Churches filled with activists planning the next demonstrations. What had once been an underground resistance movement was now the mainstream voice of the people. At the same time, the regime faced immense external pressure. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl called for openness, while leaders across Europe urged restraint. The Soviet Union, under Mikhail Gorbachev, signaled it would not intervene militarily, a stunning break from decades of doctrine. Without Soviet tanks to back it, the East German regime stood isolated. Its survival depended entirely on its ability to control its own people, and control was slipping away by the hour. For East Berliners, the days after November 4th were filled with anticipation. They knew they were living in extraordinary times, that the wall which had defined their lives might soon crumble. Yet uncertainty remained. Would the regime relent peacefully, or would it strike back in desperation? The balance was delicate, and the risk of violence hovered constantly. But the people pressed forward, undeterred. Every demonstration chipped away at the foundation of the wall, not the concrete itself, but the ideology and fear that upheld it. By early November, the unthinkable was being spoken aloud. The wall could fall. Families separated for decades could be reunited. A city divided could become whole again. And East Berlin, the showcase of repression, could become the birthplace of freedom. The revolution had begun in Leipzig, but by November 1989, it was East Berlin that carried the torch. The Alexanderplatz demonstration had revealed the truth. The wall was not an immovable monument of power. It was a fragile barrier sustained by fear, and once fear collapsed, so too would the wall. The chants grew louder, the marches larger, and the pressure unbearable. The capital was awake, and with it, the regime's fate was sealed. In the tense days following the massive demonstration at Alexanderplatz, the East German regime struggled to maintain control. The streets of East Berlin were filled with chants demanding freedom, and across the country, demonstrations swelled by the hour. The ruling Socialist Unity Party, SED, leadership gathered in meetings that stretched long into the night, desperate to find a solution that would calm the population without conceding full defeat. It was here, in the closed chambers of government offices, that the seeds of a historic blunder were planted. Egon Krenz, the newly installed General Secretary of the SED, understood that the state was teetering on collapse. The old strategy of repression was untenable. 500,000 people had flooded Alexanderplatz, and violence on that scale would have drawn global outrage. At the same time, the economic crisis deepened. Factories faltered, shortages multiplied, and young people poured into embassies in Prague and Warsaw, demanding passage to the West. East Germany was bleeding citizens, its legitimacy disintegrating with every departure. The leadership considered limited reforms as a way to stem the tide. The most pressing demand was freedom of travel. For years, East Germans had been hemmed in by restrictions that made it nearly impossible to leave the country legally. Families separated by the wall longed for reunions. Others simply wanted the freedom to cross into West Berlin, to see for themselves the life that glittered beyond the concrete barrier. Pressure mounted from every direction: citizens, international leaders, and even reformers within the SED itself. On November 9, 1989, the Politburo drafted new regulations. These were not intended to open the borders completely, but to allow East Germans to apply for exit visas under more lenient conditions. It was meant as a controlled release valve, a way to quiet the protests while keeping the wall intact. Yet the language of the policy was vague, the implementation hurried, and the leadership disorganized. The text of the new regulation was not thoroughly vetted, nor were officials properly briefed on how to present it. In the pressure cooker of revolution, details that might have seemed minor became the pivot of history. The man chosen to announce the new rules was Günter Schabowski, a senior official of the SED. Schabowski was a loyal party functionary, known more for his bureaucratic steadiness than for charisma or sharp intellect. That evening, he was scheduled to hold a routine press conference in East Berlin, updating both domestic and international journalists on the regime's position. Few could have imagined that within hours, his words would trigger the collapse of the wall itself. The press conference began in the late afternoon, a typical affair in a crowded room filled with reporters. Cameras whirred, pens scratched, and Schabowski, seated at a table beneath harsh lights, read from a stack of notes. He spoke in the familiar monotone of state officials, outlining government policy in the language of control and stability. At first, there was little to distinguish this event from dozens of previous briefings. But then came the pivotal moment. Near the end of the conference, an Italian journalist asked a simple question: when do these new travel regulations take effect? Schabowski, shuffling through his papers, appeared momentarily confused. He had not been fully briefed on the details. He hesitated, looked down, and then uttered the words that would reverberate around the globe. As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay. The statement landed like a thunderclap. Journalists in the room froze, glancing at one another in disbelief. Immediately, without delay, the implication was staggering. The Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War, was open. Cameras captured the moment, and within minutes, the news flashed across international wire services. Television networks in the West interrupted programming to announce the breaking story. East Berliners, watching state television or listening to Western broadcasts, heard the words and felt a surge of disbelief and exhilaration. Of course, Schabowski had misspoken. The regulations were not meant to open the borders unconditionally. Citizens were still supposed to apply for visas, and the process was to be managed in an orderly fashion beginning the next day. But the words were out, broadcast live, impossible to retract. In the charged atmosphere of 1989, nuance was lost. For ordinary East Germans, worn down by decades of restrictions, Schabowski's phrase was not bureaucratic error, it was liberation. Crowds began to gather at border checkpoints almost immediately. Families hurried through the streets, neighbors shouted the news across courtyards, and phones rang with urgent voices spreading the word: the wall is open. By evening, thousands pressed against the gates at Bornholmer Strasse. one of the main crossings between East and West Berlin. Guards, bewildered and unprepared, faced a swelling sea of citizens demanding passage. The confusion among border officials was profound. They had received no orders, no instructions for handling the situation. Many assumed it was a misunderstanding. But how could they deny the masses when state television had broadcast that the rules were effective immediately? The pressure grew unbearable as the crowd chanted, shouted, and surged forward. Soldiers knew that using violence would spark a bloodbath, one that could spiral out of control. At last, around 11:30 p.m., Colonel Harold Jaeger, the officer in charge at Bornholmer Strasse, made a fateful decision. Overwhelmed and unwilling to shed blood, he gave the order to raise the barrier. The first East Berliners streamed across, cheering, crying, embracing strangers. The news raced through the city, and soon every checkpoint was flooded. Guards, unable to hold back the tide, opened gate after gate. By midnight, thousands of East Berliners poured into West Berlin. The air was electric with celebration. Strangers embraced atop the wall, families reunited, and champagne bottles popped in the streets. Westerners rushed to greet their Eastern neighbors, pulling them into bars, clubs, and living rooms. For a city long divided, it was a night of astonishing unity. Back in East Berlin, the leadership reeled. The blunder was irreversible. The wall, once the iron barrier of the Cold War, had fallen not through war or negotiation, but through a bureaucratic slip of the tongue. Schabowski's misstatement had become a catalyst for revolution. By dawn, the world had changed. The press conference of November 9th stands as one of history's most extraordinary moments, a reminder of how fragile great powers can be, how the fate of nations can turn on a single phrase. It was a mistake, yes, but also the crystallization of decades of longing, courage, and resistance. The wall had stood because people believed it immovable. That night, they discovered it was not. The night of November 9th, 1989, began like so many others in East Berlin. Gray skies fading into darkness, the chill of autumn seeping into concrete courtyards, the glow of state television filling cramped apartments. But as evening wore on, a strange energy began to pulse through the streets, carried by whispers, phone calls, and the insistent rhythm of footsteps heading toward the border crossings. Something had shifted. The words spoken by Gunter Schabowski at his press conference, immediately, without delay, spread like wildfire, igniting hope where despair had lived for decades. By 7 p.m., small groups had already begun gathering at Bornholmer Strasse, the northern checkpoint that linked East and West Berlin. They came tentatively at first, unsure if the news was real, but their numbers grew as the hours passed. Families with children, young students, elderly men and women. Thousands of faces pressed into the darkness, craning for a glimpse of the gates that had long defined their lives. Many clutched identity cards or passports, hoping to test whether this newfound freedom was genuine. The border guards were bewildered. Their orders were unchanged. No one was to cross without proper authorization. Yet television broadcasts had declared otherwise. The soldiers could feel the weight of history bearing down on them. But they were also terrified. Their weapons were loaded, but few had the stomach for violence. Behind them, the wall loomed, silent and impassive, its concrete skin suddenly fragile under the pressure of human will. By 8 p.m., the crowd swelled to tens of thousands. Chants rose into the night air. Tor auf! Tor auf! Open the gate! Open the gate! The shouts grew louder, more insistent, until they became a thunder that rattled the nerves of every soldier on duty. At the command post, Colonel Harold Jaeger listened to his men's frantic reports. He radioed his superiors, begging for instructions, but the lines were clogged with confusion. No clear orders came. Each minute dragged like an eternity. Meanwhile, across the city, West Berliners heard the news. Word spread in pubs, on trams, in living rooms where radios blared. Crowds rushed to the western side of the wall, gathering at the Brandenburg Gate, Checkpoint Charlie, and dozens of other crossings. They climbed onto parked cars, waved signs, shouted encouragement across the concrete divide. They could see their fellow Germans on the other side, pressing forward, demanding passage. History, they realized, was unfolding before their eyes. Back at Bornholmer Strasse, the situation reached breaking point. It was now past 9 p.m., and the crush of people threatened to topple the barriers. Guards tried to turn back individuals, but the sheer force of the crowd was overwhelming. Mothers held their children aloft so they would not be crushed. Elderly men leaned heavily on their canes, determined not to be left behind. The air was thick with desperation and joy, a combustible mix that could explode with the slightest spark. Jaeger faced a terrible choice. If he gave the order to fire, hundreds could die, and blood would flood the streets. If he kept the gate closed, the pressure would mount until violence erupted anyway. And if he opened the gate without authorization, he risked being branded a traitor. In that moment, he chose humanity over obedience. At 11:30 p.m., with trembling hands, he gave the command, "Let them through." The first barrier lifted. A roar erupted from the crowd. Tears streamed down faces as East Berliners surged forward, clutching passports, shouting in disbelief. They spilled into the checkpoint, past stunned guards who no longer resisted. Families embraced, strangers kissed, and laughter mixed with sobs. It was not orderly, nor was it controlled. It was a flood of humanity breaking through a dam that had held too long. On the western side, the response was immediate. West Berliners rushed forward to greet their brothers and sisters. They pressed flowers into their hands, pulled them into waiting cars, invited them to parties, bars, and homes. The city, divided for 28 years, was suddenly alive with reunion. People danced atop the wall, champagne bottles popped, and car horns blared in joyous cacophony. At Checkpoint Charlie, one of the most iconic crossings, similar scenes unfolded. The crowd there was immense, pressing against the barriers with chants of freedom. Guards hesitated, radios crackled with conflicting orders, but the tide of humanity was unstoppable. By midnight, they too relented, raising the gates and allowing thousands to stream across. Within hours, every crossing point was overwhelmed. For many, the first moments in the West were surreal. East Berliners wandered wide-eyed through the neon-lit streets of Kurfürstendamm, marveling at shop windows filled with goods they had only dreamed of. Children gawked at bananas, oranges, and candy bars. Adults sipped Coca-Cola with trembling hands, laughing at the absurdity of the moment. West Berliners, equally moved, lined the streets with gifts, flowers, fruit, toys, chocolate, bottles of beer. The city became one massive embrace, a festival of unity under the cold November sky. Television cameras captured it all, broadcasting live to a stunned world. Viewers from Tokyo to New York watched in awe as Germans clambered onto the wall, wielding hammers and chisels to chip away at its surface. Each blow was met with cheers. The wall, once an immovable symbol of oppression, now trembled under the collective will of the people. What had seemed permanent just hours before was crumbling in real time. Meanwhile, inside the East German government offices, chaos reigned. The leadership was paralyzed, unsure how to respond. Some advocated restoring order with force, but it was too late. The dam had broken. The wall was falling not because officials decreed it, but because ordinary people demanded it, and no one dared stop them. The regime had lost its final weapon, fear. Through the night, Berlin became a city of miracles. Families separated for decades were reunited in tearful embraces. Lovers long divided by politics clasped hands once more. For many, the night was too overwhelming to comprehend. They wandered the streets until dawn, unable to sleep, unwilling to let the moment pass. In the shared laughter and tears, centuries of division seemed to dissolve. By morning, the wall was no longer a prison. It was a gathering place, a stage for celebration. Crowds climbed its concrete face, straddling the divide as though to prove that it no longer mattered. The air rang with songs, cheers, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers against stone. Berlin had become not just a city, but a symbol of possibility, a testament to the power of ordinary people to change the course of history. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not orchestrated by generals or politicians. It was not the result of treaties or battles. It was the work of citizens who refused to be bound any longer, who took a misstatement at a press conference and turned it into a revolution. That night, they claimed not only their city but their future. The wall, which had cast its shadow for 28 long years, fell in a single night. And though pieces of its concrete would remain for years, its true collapse was not physical, but psychological. The fear that had sustained it was gone forever. The morning of November 10th, 1989, dawned upon a transformed world. Berliners who had danced through the night awoke to headlines already blazing across the globe. Newspapers rushed to capture the moment in black ink before it faded into memory. "The wall falls," screamed bold letters from New York to Paris, from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. Television screens flickered with images of jubilant crowds atop the wall, swinging sledgehammers, kissing strangers, waving German flags stitched hurriedly from bedsheets. For once, the Cold War's narrative of confrontation, secrecy, and stalemate was replaced by a single image of liberation. The world was transfixed. In Washington, D.C., President George H.W. Bush received the news with cautious restraint. The White House Situation Room was buzzing with excitement, aides urging him to make a triumphant declaration. But Bush, ever the diplomat, held back. He feared that gloating might humiliate the Soviet Union and provoke an unpredictable backlash. Instead, he chose measured words. The American people rejoiced with the German people, but the story was theirs to write. Behind closed doors, though, officials marveled at what they were witnessing. For decades, the wall had been the defining scar of the Cold War. Its fall meant not just an opening in Berlin, but a crack in the very architecture of global power. Across the Atlantic, London reacted with a mix of astonishment and apprehension. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who had once warned against the speed of German reunification, was visibly unsettled. She admired the courage of the German people, but feared the geopolitical consequences of a unified Germany rising again in the heart of Europe. "We beat the Germans twice," she had told aides in private. "Now they're back." Her pragmatism, however, could not silence the images of joy flooding television screens. British newspapers captured the mood of their readers rather than their leaders. Exhilaration, solidarity, and disbelief that the unthinkable had happened. In Paris, President François Mitterrand faced similar ambivalence. He had long sought to anchor France at the center of a European project precisely to prevent Germany from becoming too dominant. Yet even he could not deny the emotional power of the moment. For ordinary Parisians, the wall's fall was seen as a triumph of humanity, a release from fear, and an opportunity for Europe to reclaim unity after decades of division. Crowds gathered at the Eiffel Tower, holding candles and waving signs of support for their German neighbors. But perhaps the most crucial response came from Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev, whose policies of glasnost and perestroika had loosened the Soviet grip, was now confronted with the consequences of his reforms. The images pouring from Berlin were broadcast across the Soviet Union, sparking both admiration and anxiety. Hardliners in the Politburo grumbled that the empire was unraveling, that Gorbachev had allowed weakness to seep into the Soviet sphere. But Gorbachev, acutely aware of the futility of force, resisted the calls for intervention. The Red Army, once feared as the guardian of the Iron Curtain, remained in its barracks. For perhaps the first time since World War II, Moscow let history unfold without tanks. That decision ensured that the Berlin Wall would fall not in blood, but in celebration. Elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc, the wall's collapse reverberated like a shockwave. In Prague, dissidents who had been gathering momentum under the banner of Charter 77 felt vindicated. The Velvet Revolution was already stirring, and the images from Berlin fueled their courage. In Warsaw, where solidarity had clawed open space for democracy, the fall of the wall was greeted as confirmation that Poland's struggle had been the harbinger of change. In Budapest, Hungarians who had cut the first holes in the Iron Curtain just months before celebrated as pioneers of a movement that could no longer be contained. Even in faraway capitals, the symbolism of the wall's fall was immediate. In Beijing, Chinese authorities viewed the spectacle with nervous eyes. The memory of Tiananmen Square, just 5 months earlier, was still raw. The sight of Berliners toppling barriers reminded them of their own citizens who had demanded reform and been silenced with gunfire. State media downplayed the event, but whispers traveled through universities and factories. If Berlin could change, why not Beijing? In South Africa, the apartheid regime watched uneasily. The notion of barriers falling, of oppressed people reclaiming their dignity, resonated deeply with those living under racial segregation. Activists drew parallels between the wall in Berlin and the invisible walls of apartheid in Johannesburg and Cape Town. Nelson Mandela, still imprisoned on Robben Island, would soon emerge into a world where the very symbol of division had been shattered. For the people of Berlin, however, the world's gaze was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Western journalists flooded the city, microphones and cameras chasing every embrace, every tear, every stroke of a hammer against concrete. The wall became the most photographed object on Earth, its graffiti-covered surface transformed into an art gallery of freedom. Respect, wallpeckers, arrived with chisels and hammers, eager to claim souvenirs. Chunks of concrete, once oppressive and hated, became relics, carried away in pockets, sold in shops, displayed in museums. Each fragment told a story of repression overcome. That day, Berlin was no longer merely a city. It was a metaphor, a stage upon which the Cold War played its final act. The Brandenburg Gate, long sealed off, became the epicenter of celebration. East and West Berliners scaled its roof, waving flags against a clear November sky. Musicians set up impromptu performances, choirs sang hymns of unity, and church bells rang in unison across the city. For one extraordinary day, Berlin seemed not like a place divided, but like the beating heart of the world. International leaders rushed to position themselves. Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of West Germany, cut short a visit to Poland to return to Bonn. His government was already preparing proposals for reunification, though cautiously, so as not to alarm allies or adversaries. Hans Madro, the new East German prime minister, insisted that reforms were necessary but tried to slow the tide toward unification. He proposed a better socialism, but few were listening. The tide of history had turned, and it was carrying Germany toward a future neither leader could fully control. For ordinary people around the world, the wall's fall meant something deeply personal. In New York, Berlin, expats crowded bars, weeping as they watched television screens. In Sydney, students painted murals of the crumbling wall on university walls. In Tokyo, newspapers ran special editions with full-color spreads, unusual in their seriousness, to capture the moment. From Buenos Aires to Nairobi, from Seoul to Toronto, the story of Berlin was not just news. It was a reminder of human resilience, of the capacity for change. And yet, amid the celebration, there was unease. Could this unity last? Would Germany become too strong? Would the Soviet Union retaliate? Could Europe handle the economic shock of absorbing the East? These questions rippled through diplomatic circles, but on the streets of Berlin, they seemed distant. What mattered was the sound of hammers against concrete, the embrace of long-separated families, the laughter echoing through streets once patrolled by fear. In those first 24 hours after the wall fell, the world did not yet know what would follow. Reunification, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the birth of a new Europe. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that a wall meant to stand forever had fallen overnight, not by bombs or treaties, but by the will of ordinary people who believed in freedom. The Berlin Wall's fall was not just Germany's story. It belonged to the world. The euphoric collapse of the Berlin Wall was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one even more complicated. On the morning of November 10th, 1989, when Berliners awakened after their night of jubilation, the city looked transformed, but the deeper work of transformation had barely begun. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Germans on both sides could walk freely across their once forbidden border. But uniting families, economies, and identities fractured for 40 years would prove a challenge unlike any other. Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of West Germany, recognized that the moment demanded vision. Just days after the wall fell, he unveiled a 10-point plan for reunification. It proposed not only closer cooperation between the two Germanys, but ultimately their political merger. Many considered the plan audacious, even reckless, but Kohl sensed that history was moving too quickly to hesitate. The wall had crumbled because the people demanded change. It was his task to give that change form. For East Germans, however, reunification was not only a dream fulfilled, but also a leap into the unknown. The collapse of the Socialist Unity Party's monopoly meant an end to the rigid structures that had defined everyday life. The centrally planned economy, long shielded from global competition, suddenly collapsed. Factories shuttered, state-run shops closed, and millions found themselves unemployed almost overnight. East German marks, once the currency of everyday life, were replaced by the West German Deutsche Mark. For many, this exchange symbolized freedom, but it also revealed the vast economic gulf between the two Germanys. Overnight, East Germans discovered that their savings, their skills, and their industries were valued less than they had believed. Yet material hardship could not erase the emotional power of reunification. Families long divided by checkpoints now embraced freely. Elderly parents saw children they had last held as infants. Couples who had married across the border but lived apart finally shared homes. Churches that had been separated by the wall filled with worshippers from both sides, their hymns carrying the weight of reunion. Railway lines that had once been severed were stitched back together, trains again rumbling across landscapes once guarded by mines and watchtowers. Still, not all emotions were joyous. West Germans often regarded their Eastern compatriots with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. They called them Aussies, a word laced with condescension, implying backwardness, inefficiency, or naivete. East Germans, in turn, viewed Wessis as arrogant, materialistic, and dismissive of their sacrifices. These cultural clashes played out in workplaces, neighborhoods, and schools. While the wall itself had fallen, invisible walls of prejudice and misunderstanding lingered. Internationally, reunification stirred both hope and unease. The United States largely supported it, viewing a unified Germany as a bulwark of democracy in Europe. President George H.W. Bush reassured allies that Germany's strength could be channeled into NATO and a broader European framework. France, under François Mitterrand, hesitated, fearing that a powerful Germany might dominate the continent once again. Margaret Thatcher was even blunter, warning colleagues that Europe had spent the 20th century containing Germany's ambitions. Yet Kohl, with deft diplomacy, promised that a united Germany would anchor itself firmly in European institutions. In exchange for support, he agreed to push forward with deeper European integration, a decision that would eventually lead to the creation of the euro. Meanwhile, Mikhail Gorbachev faced his own reckoning. The Soviet Union had maintained troops in East Germany since World War II, and their withdrawal became one of the thorniest questions of reunification. Many feared that hardliners might seize upon the humiliation to destabilize his leadership. But Gorbachev, already grappling with a crumbling Soviet economy and rising independence movements across Eastern Europe, chose pragmatism. He accepted Western financial aid in exchange for Soviet acquiescence to reunification. His choice helped ensure that Germany's rebirth was peaceful, but it also accelerated the unraveling of the Soviet Empire. As negotiations progressed, the emotional center remained Berlin. Once divided into 4 occupation zones, the city symbolized both Germany's defeat and its division. Now it became the capital of reunification. The Reichstag, long a dormant monument, was prepared to house a new parliament. The Brandenburg Gate, once sealed off by barbed wire, became the stage for ceremonies of unity. David Hasselhoff even sang from atop the wall on New Year's Eve 1989, his pop anthem, Looking for Freedom, becoming, improbably, the soundtrack of a nation's rebirth. By October 3, 1990, less than a year after the wall's fall, Germany was officially reunified. Fireworks lit the skies, choirs sang Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and the German flag was raised over Berlin. What had seemed unimaginable just 12 months earlier was now reality. A nation once cleaved by ideology was whole again. The day became known as the Tag der Deutschen Einheit, German Unity Day. Yet the challenges did not end with the ceremony. The economic disparities between East and West proved immense. In the East, unemployment soared, industries collapsed, and frustration deepened. Many East Germans felt that reunification had meant not partnership but takeover, that their history and identity had been erased in favor of Western norms. Ghost towns emerged in rural areas as young people left for opportunities in the West. The shimmering promises of capitalism did not always match the harsh realities of daily survival. Politically, reunification reshaped Europe. With Germany at its heart, the European community moved toward greater integration. Kohl and his ally, Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, reassured neighbors that a united Germany would not dominate, but would instead lead through cooperation. Their commitment to a common currency and deeper European ties laid the groundwork for the European Union. Culturally, the wall lingered as both scar and symbol. Artists painted its fragments, museums displayed its remains, and memory projects sought to preserve its story. For younger generations, the wall became less a lived experience and more a cautionary tale. For those who had lived in its shadow, however, it remained a wound that healed slowly. Many continued to wrestle with the meaning of identity. Were they East German, West German, or simply German? The fall of the Berlin Wall had been celebrated as a miracle of freedom, but reunification revealed the complexities of healing a divided nation. It was not merely about knocking down concrete, but about rebuilding trust, dignity, and belonging. Yet despite its difficulties, Germany's story became a beacon for others. From Prague to Johannesburg, from Vilnius to Seoul, the sight of Germans reuniting suggested that division need not be permanent, that even walls built of fear and power could one day crumble. As the 1990s unfolded, Germany emerged not as a threat, but as a cornerstone of Europe. Its economy, bolstered by enormous investment, became one of the strongest in the world. Berlin transformed into a cosmopolitan capital, alive with art, culture, and memory. And though scars of division persisted, the dream of unity proved stronger. The fall of the Berlin Wall was an accident born of miscommunication, but reunification was a triumph born of persistence. The wall had fallen overnight, but the work of bringing two halves together stretched across decades. It was imperfect, uneven, and fraught with tension. Yet it succeeded in one essential truth. Germany was whole again, and Europe had crossed the threshold into a new era. In the end, the wall's collapse was not only about Germany. It was about humanity's enduring refusal to accept division as destiny. It was about the courage to imagine a world without barriers. And it was about the hope that mistakes, sometimes even those made in a hurried press conference, could change the world for the better. On the night of November 9th, 1989, the world watched as ordinary Berliners climbed atop concrete that had defined their lives for nearly 3 decades. They danced, sang, and wielded hammers against the wall that had scarred their city and their souls. Few moments in modern history captured so vividly the sudden collapse of oppression. Yet what made this event extraordinary was not only the breaking of stone, but the unraveling of fear. The Berlin Wall was never just a structure of concrete and wire. It was a symbol of how power can divide, how ideology can imprison, and how human lives can be written into rigid lines. Its fall proved that even the strongest symbols of control are fragile when confronted with the collective will of people who refuse to remain silent. The story of the wall's collapse is often told as a triumph of diplomacy, or as the result of geopolitical shifts that weakened the Soviet Union. These elements are true, but they obscure the profound humanity at its core. The wall fell not because of treaties or armies, but because mothers and fathers, students and workers, pastors and activists demanded a different future. Their protests in Leipzig, their whispered conversations, their determination to cross borders despite the risk of death. All of these laid the groundwork. When Gunter Schabowski's misstatement at a press conference inadvertently opened the gates, the people were already prepared to flood through. The accident became destiny because courage had already primed the moment. Reunification revealed that tearing down walls is easier than healing the wounds they leave. The joy of unity soon gave way to the hard realities of reconciling two systems, two economies, two cultures. For East Germans, freedom brought disorientation as old certainties dissolved. For West Germans, unity carried the burden of responsibility and cost. Yet even through hardship, the significance of that November night endured. It reminded the world that history does not always follow the logic of generals and politicians. Sometimes, it turns on the voices of ordinary people, on the tremor of a crowd singing for freedom, or even on the misplaced words of a bureaucrat. The fall of the Berlin Wall reshaped not only Germany, but the entire world order. It accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union, shifted the trajectory of Europe, and ignited hope in movements far beyond the Iron Curtain. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela would soon walk free. In the Baltic states, independence surged forward. In places where walls, real or metaphorical, still stood, Berlin became a rallying cry. No barrier is eternal. Today, fragments of the wall stand in museums, city squares, and memorials across the globe. Some are painted with graffiti, others left bare. Each fragment whispers the same lesson. Walls built on fear are destined to fall. Yet it would be naive to think the world has left walls behind. From physical borders to digital firewalls, from divisions of race and class to the isolation of political tribes, humanity continues to construct barriers. The story of Berlin is not only a triumph to be remembered, but a warning to be heeded. The wall's fall reminds us of the fragile balance between freedom and fear. It teaches that the arc of history bends toward openness, but only when people are willing to push. And it leaves us with a paradox both humbling and inspiring. One of the greatest turning points of the 20th century was not orchestrated by grand strategy, but triggered by a mistake. From that mistake came liberation. From that liberation came unity. And from unity came the possibility of a Europe once divided, now whole. The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years, but its collapse reshaped generations. Its concrete may be gone, but its shadow continues to stretch across time. In that shadow lies a question for us all. Will we build new walls, or will we find the courage to tear them down?